Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by Professor Philip Ewell of Hunter College of the University of New York. He is a professor of music theory. He is also the author of the new book on music theory and making music more welcoming for everyone, available from the University of Michigan Press as part of their music and social justice series of books. Professor Ewell, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I look forward to this conversation.
Well, I thought I'd start by asking you for your reaction to a recent incident involving music and race. The longtime publisher of Rolling Stone was interviewed in the New York Times recently and made appalling comments because he's got a new book coming out, and it's called something like The Masters, where he interviews rock and rollers, and he picked 8 white guys, Jagger, Richards, Dylan, whatever. The New York Times interviewer asked him the quite basic question you might think he'd be ready for: why did you pick entirely white men? And he said outright that he did not think women or people of color were articulate, that he didn't think they were philosophers of rock. Everyone was shocked by this. He's immediately kicked out of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, where he's had a prestigious position for a while. But I thought that one person who would not have been shocked was you, because he articulated something that is rarely put that explicitly, but is implicit everywhere in music all the time.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah, that's exactly right. This is Wenner or Jann or Jann, I don't know how he pronounces it. And I think he's about mid-70s. And yes, he's a white cisgender man. And what he said didn't surprise me. You're absolutely right, Nathan. From that generation, I often say that I have just a little bit of empathy because, obviously there's some interesting things. Rolling Stone, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, those are, icons of American popular music. And things are changing so quickly. I have a little bit of empathy for folks like that. Things that were said 30, 40, 50 years ago don't get said today. But underlying it was exactly the type of thing that I'm trying to expose with my work, which is this essentially white supremacist, patriarchal foundation on which we have built music and music education in the United States, up to and including popular musics, as evidenced with this episode. For him to say that, he's just saying something that he actually believes. And more important, Nathan, he's saying something that a great many people of his generation actually believe, that the true philosophers of popular music could only be the Bob Dylans and the Mick Jaggers and the Beatles, etc. And they just don't want to look at themselves in the mirror and say to themselves, I believe that because these people are white, and I believe that because they are male. That's a bridge too far. It's too painful to acknowledge the whiteness and the maleness. But that's really what's going on there.
I was just so fascinated by those comments because I thought, he probably has never even asked himself, why are these the people that I think of as the masters, the philosophers? What are my criteria that are determining the exclusion of every non-white person from this category? I mean, I'm sure it's never even crossed his mind, and Utah, this process of canon formation, that's why I want to transition to is, kind of at the heart of your book, deciding who matters, what the serious music is, what the art is, who's worth talking about and studying.
Nathan, you touched on something that's so important. How is it that a person like that came to these decisions, right? Have they ever even asked themselves these key questions? My response is, how could they have 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago? I'm 57 years old. I myself rarely asked those questions. Why it is that in my own mind, I believed somehow that these quote unquote great masters of a so-called Western canon represented the best of the best. Obviously, it was being taught to me at every step of the way, right? It was never questioned. I often say that this system of music and music education in the United States, it's a religion. It's a faith-based belief system, just like other religions, right? And when you are simply told that you have to believe it, that you can't doubt the system, that you have to have faith in the system, that it has your best interests in mind. Sound familiar? Sounds like a belief system to me. I'm a non-believer.
Yeah.
And I think that it's actually a really good analogy because my father was also an atheist, and yet he could not eat, and he was Black. Just in case the listener doesn't know that, by the way, I'm Black too. It's a podcast. But since I'm the most famous music theorist on the planet, I think most people know that I'm Black. But my father was Black, and he himself was a hook, line, and sinker, believed in the greatness of the Beethovens, the greatness of the Shakespeares. And he himself, a Black cisgender man, never questioned, never asked himself why that was the case. And that just is mind-boggling to me. But that's part of the system, right?
This is one of the most fascinating parts of your book to me, is when you talk about your father and you talk about this white racial frame that suggests that things that are European and white are better. And you point out that he had, to a great degree, internalized this. So things that were associated with, the refinement of Europe were the things that Black people ought to aspire to dominate and master. You say in the book that, he was very proud when a Black person would excel in classical music or chess or whatever it was. There was this implicit set of values of what constituted high culture, and he accepted that this was the high culture.
Without question. He accepted it on faith. He was taught that at Morehouse College, where he graduated in 1948 with Martin Luther King, by the way. And I would say, in my father's defense, he was just trying to survive in a virulently racist mid-20th century Jim Crow racism in the South, where he lived he was born in Louisiana and went to college in Georgia, right? So he lived in the South up until through college. These were the things that all Black intellectuals of that era, going back to, of course, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, this concept of the talented 10%, the top 10% of Black people. But, let's be clear. My dad did not admire those Blacks who rapped really well, or those Blacks who played basketball really well, unless they were also social activist basketball players like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or Bill Russell or others. Then he found a way to let them into his heart, right? But it had to be the Tiger Woods, the Serena Williams, the Jesse Normans on stage singing some German. And he never once questioned that all of the people who created the greatness that he claimed to know so intimately were, in fact, white cisgender men. And they had to be, because they're the only ones who could advance to candidacy for greatness in a system built on whiteness and maleness. It makes perfect sense to me now. It took me, only 57 years to figure this out. So I think I'm doing okay.
Turning to your discipline of music theory, it strikes me that in a certain sense, they should seem simple and uncontroversial, like all music is interesting and valuable, right? And you give in the book your definition of what music theory ought to be, and it's the study of all music,
exactly,
or something like that. And but it's incredible how when you apply that and you follow it through to its logical conclusion, so much of your field as it's currently constituted, is just shattered by applying this framework. What would music theory look like if we adopted the presumption that all music is valuable and interesting?
Exactly. It's funny how people call me controversial, to bring it back to that, because the subtitle of my book is Making Music More Welcoming for Everyone. I'm like, ooh, that's controversial. Oh, how controversial. Phil wants to make music welcoming. That's crazy bastard. What on earth is going on, man? No, seriously, music theory really, I often say that we play on the backside of the beat. On a rare occasion, that can be a good thing musically as a performer, but it's usually a bad thing. I mean, get with the band and play on the beat. You're making us look bad, right? And music theory is, in fact, more than other academic disciplines within music, absolutely mired in this faith-based system. When you start to express doubt, right? Because my book has, of course, a great deal of doubt in it, has a great deal of skepticism, right? And I think I would cite Richard Cheruskin, my departed colleague, very famous musicologist here, who was a skeptic at heart. He often talked about that. I mean, if we're not skeptical about what we're doing, then what are we doing? And that's a really good point that I would like to highlight to the listener. When you accept somebody standing in front of you telling you that Brahms was the greatest composer who ever lived, I mean, clearly they're expressing an opinion. They want you to believe that it's not an opinion. They want you to believe that it's decided fact, that this is history has proven, time itself has proven the greatness of Brahms. And they wouldn't for a second think to question that. And they wouldn't understand the structures and the power that people have when they play Brahms piano concertos or piano pieces, and the whole system that's been handed down to us here. Well, listen, in 1787, it's not like 55 people got together in Philadelphia and represented this rainbow coalition of people. And over here we have the Cherokee delegation, and over here we have some Scottish folks, and half of the people are women. No. They were white, propertied men, many of whom owned people, owned slaves. Do you blame them for writing a playbook, the U.S. Constitution, that benefited themselves? I'll be honest. I probably would have done the same thing. I'm a human being. I don't blame them for doing that. I just wish to highlight that, of course, represents the twin pillars of what we've done in this country, white supremacy and patriarchy. And to sit there and think that music somehow is exempt from those twin pillars, well, that would be very silly indeed.
Well, I recall when I was reading your book and when I was just listening to you, they're talking about how basically people see their ideologies as objective, factual truth. That I actually once read a long article about the racist pseudoscientist Charles Murray, who wrote a very interesting book, actually, called Human Accomplishment, where he tried to objectively tally human cultural accomplishments across the ages to prove that Europeans are superior. Sure. And he said, I'm doing this scientifically. I do it statistically. And the way I do it is I take encyclopedia entries, and whoever has the longest encyclopedia entries, whichever continent has the most musicians with encyclopedia entries, they win the objective human cultural accomplishment. And I don't think it even crossed his mind, like, who makes the encyclopedias?
Well, the great scientist, that's just ironclad logic there, Nathan. Yeah. Charles Murray, he's like a modern day Arthur de Gobineau, right? Who wrote the 4-volume essay on the inequality of human races. I'm just calling balls and strikes here. I'm just like putting out, some objective knowledge about this is just how things are. And it just turns out that white people are the coolest, the smartest, the dopest, the flyest. I'm just a scientist. I'm Hermes here. I'm just transmitting a message. This happened in music and music education in the early 20th century with the musical pseudoscientist Carl Seashore. Julia Eklund-Koza has a great book called Destined to Fail, and it unpacks some of the musicianship tests that he cooked up in his white supremacist mind. And I remember reading about one where he had like a sample set of 600 students. And lo and behold, there were only 2 Black students who could meet the bar. It's just objective framing of musicianship and musical capabilities. And clearly the Black mind, because our brains are smaller, that's what phrenologists proved, right? With their little caliper things going around our skulls. So we're just pointing out the objective truth to the situation here.
But it struck me that I recalled Charles Murray's Human Accomplishment because his explanation of what all the superior music is and the objective human accomplishment in the field of music maps on pretty well to mainstream music theory textbooks, which is what you go into in the book. Obviously, a lot of people in the social sciences, view him as like a real fringe racist. But again, to turn to your field and the values that are embedded in it, it strikes me, I don't know much about music theory, but we had a, long piece of current affairs about it by an expert, and I read your book, and it, it strikes me that your field is in many ways stuck in the 19th century. It is close to phrenology in some ways.
It is. It's sad to say. We are losing some of those shackles, but you really have to look at folks who are, let's say, under 40 years old. I mean, that's unsurprising, right? The younger generations, they're less invested in the field, right? As it has been passed down to us by people who are, let's say, white supremacist aligned, right? Adjacent. These folks don't have, no one's donning a white hood and a cape here and lynching Negroes or something like that. But the field itself is very far in the past. And yes, the textbook analysis that my colleague Megan Lyons and I did uncovered that, 98, 99% of the musical examples in there were written by white men. And then, you point that out, and of course, you just start dumping a few Black composers in there kind of like as an afterthought, right? rather than questioning the foundations of the field itself, which is what I'm doing. I like to question the foundations. I like to say, why is it that the power has always rested in these people's hands? I could point out the simple fact that playing the piano is a requisite to being a music theorist under this scenario. And knowing some German language is also prerequisite. So if you're a great pianist and you know German, you're kind of already a music theorist, whether you know it or not. And in fact, that's just one language of many, and that's just one instrument of many. Of course, music theory from the mid to late 20th century would have us believe that they were by far and away the most important language and the most important instrument. And that is complete nonsense. That's just nonsense. And anybody who tries to tell me that that's not nonsense, who get unnerved by me saying that, I would just say that it's gaslighting, frankly. It's gaslighting that's been gone on for just way too long, decades, if not centuries. It's gaslighting and it's nonsense. And it's time we move on from these things. Now, of course, the people who will, my detractors will hasten to say, oh, Philip, you will hate the music of Franz Schubert.
Right.
Philip Ewell.
You're canceling him.
You're canceling Franz Schubert, Phil. Or Philip Ewell doesn't play the piano. So that's what sour grapes with Philip Ewell. Fine. People are, haters going to hate. That's fine. I can handle that. Of course, anybody who reads more than 3 pages of my book, and I do not include John McWhorter in that because that's probably about the number of pages John McWhorter wrote before he wrote his hit piece on me in the New York Times.
Did he write about you? Oh, my God. That guy.
Oh, yeah. Go and check out the hit piece on John McWhorter, which I say, thanks, John. You just made me a ton of money because my book flew off the shelf after that piece. And more important than lining my pockets, he actually is helping me make my argument because it's such a silly bit of drivel that he wrote that people are actually getting involved. People in music, okay? People outside of music, maybe he's actually having an impact. But I don't care about the Tucker Carlsons. I just don't care about them. At any rate, getting back to the issue at hand here, it's really important to realize that as it's been handed down to us, there's so much, well, like I said, gaslighting and unquestioning nature of what we do. And it's time we really start to unpack that. No, I don't hate Schubert. No, I don't hate Beethoven. I kind of like them. They're good composers. But I just don't think that they should be up on any hallowed hilltop because of our faith-based belief system that tells me that they're on a hallowed hilltop and others are just below them in ranked hierarchies. That's just silly. Shakespeare died in 1616, folks. And isn't 400 years a good enough run for good old Billy Shakespeare? I think it's time to just let go of some of these things. People are just like, oh, you have to go and see this new King Lear, Phil. It's in a new staging. Like, of course it's in a new staging. How else could you put up a new King Lear, for heaven's sake? It was written 420 years ago.
So, yeah, I mean, you point out that to the extent that arguments are made to support this conception of what the superior or sophisticated music is, they really are very, I mean, they crumble under scrutiny, which is like, if you say, for example, that, classical European music is, well, that's the music we study because it's sophisticated, it's complex. And then you come back and you go, excuse me, jazz music? Why isn't that at the center of music? If you were going to build a study that, if you were going to have the hierarchy of complexity was going to be the most interesting, you would have a totally different field if you applied that standard consistently. So there's no standard that you could apply that would get you to logically, rationally, it just so happens that all the white composers are the best composers.
Right. It's impossible. Really. I mean, once you actually realize that the argument really truly is based in whiteness and maleness, this idea of sophistication, civilization, complexity, complicatedness, right? Once you simply just accept that we were handed this, basically, as a bill of goods that was not truly what it claimed to be, then it becomes quite easy actually to realize, well, yeah, of course, we segregated out jazz because it's at its core an African-American musical genre. It needed to be segregated out just like African-American people did. I mean, that's very simple. That's just called racial purity in a white supremacist system. So just like people were segregated out, the musics needed to be segregated out too. And then, of course, you can trash jazz and everything. Finally, it gets let into the pantheon of greatness. And what happens? Well, the first thing is white men start to, quote unquote, discover jazz. That's in the 60s, right? In the 70s. Mm-hmm. The next thing is they begin to play jazz. Of course, we all know the great jazz white male artists. Jazz has a very strong patriarchal element. Obviously, your listeners are going to know that. So very few women names, but of course they were always there. Valerie Capers, Mary Lou Williams, Jerry Allen, beautiful composers and musicians who were shunted to the side because they were women, of course. But, have let it into our academies, Jazz. Well, what happens? White people take over because it all of a sudden has some currency, right? So I've taught at 3 places. They've all had great jazz departments. And out of, let's say, 15 different jazzers, I can remember 1 Black jazz person. The other 14 were white. And I mean, no disrespect to these colleagues, some of whom are friends to this day. I simply wish to point out that jazz became white when it became academic, which is a very telling thing, right? It's a very telling thing.
Yeah. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more for those of us who aren't familiar with the curriculum of music theory and what it is that music theorists study, the ways in which I think it's easy for people to understand, your textbook analysis is very straightforward. You look at who are the composers that are included, who are excluded. And, and you provide a pretty knockdown demonstration that the field is racist just by going like, who's considered worthy of inclusion in the textbook.
Who's represented.
But how is it in more kind of subtle ways that what is presented as being interesting for study in music has kind of these same buried assumptions in it?
Yeah, I think that the best thing to look at probably would be musicianship requirements and specifically piano proficiency requirements. So it's built on music theory as is presented to undergraduates in the United States of America. Of course, it's just presented as music studies, right? It's not presented as the very narrow slice of Europe that it represents. I mean, sometimes people say European, right? That's just entirely misleading. We're talking about Vienna, Berlin, Paris, going back to Venice and a few places, right? Of course, a few more cities in Germany, like Leipzig or Köthen or something like that. But we're talking about not even 1% of the European continent, honestly, right? And of course, we're not talking about the musical traditions of the Roma, of the Arabs or the Sami or the Mongols or the Turks or the Ahmadis. The people who have been in Europe, the BIPOC people who've been there with their musical traditions for centuries, and yes, Nathan, millennia, right? In other words, there's never been a time where there have been no BIPOC people or populations in Europe. That's a fallacy. If somebody thinks that it's just all white, that's just silly. But when you come back to the United States, so yes, they say European music, and Americans, we're not that smart. So we say, yeah, sure, Europe, whatever. It's a continent over there. But it really is just a few places, Germany prime among them, German-speaking territories prime among them. And we present it as this is the way we should think about music. And of course, the idea that pitch and the piano and 12 tones in a system that emanated, to be blunt, from the Catholic Church is the system that represents all music. That's kind of what we've been teaching. And of course, colonization, you have to immediately think about the idea of presenting these, what were essentially white supremacist and patriarchal ideas across the globe in a colonial context. Of course, Christianity played a massive role in that. One thing I haven't done enough research in is to just look at all the music theory textbooks and realize I'm teaching Theory 1 currently. And literally last night, I'm like, oh my God, all of these hymns, all of these chorales, all of this Jesu meine Freude, Jesus, my pain and suffering. I'm like, there's just a lot of Christianity in the music theory textbooks, which I didn't really, with Megan, dig into. Maybe that's the next project, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about Catholic traditions morphing into German Protestant traditions of making music. Of course, Bach was considered by many music theorists the first great composer. That's nonsense, of course, but he was a very, very devout man. There was a period of 1717 to 1723. For 5-6 years, he lived in Köthen, Bach did, and he was employed by people other than the church. And that's when he wrote his secular music, like his violins, solo violin parties and sonatas, his 6 cello suites, the English suites, the French suites, etc. So for 6 years, he wrote non-sacred music or secular music. For the rest of his life, he wrote Christian Lutheran music. And that has become the de facto type of studying music in the United States. And we present it to our students like it's just music. And it is, of course, not. It's very, very narrow. It's based in this case, Christianity, whiteness and maleness all wrapped together. And Germanism, let's say, and pianism. Those are the core elements. And we present it to our students. And it's high time that we simply pull it down off of that hallowed hilltop, present it. I'm not saying cancel it. That's just ridiculous when people start saying cancel. There's no truth to that. I've never wanted to cancel anything, not even Heinrich Schenker, when people say that I do. And I'm like, no, I wrote very explicitly, I don't want to cancel this one.
No matter how many times you write, I would still like these things to be taught. They'll go, he doesn't want it to be taught anywhere in the country. He's trying to purge the curriculum. Yeah, I know.
Exactly. It's just going to be part of this nonsensical debate. And I don't take part in those bad faith debates. I only take part in good faith discussions like the one we're having here. The music education in the United States, it's a very narrow thing. But I have to say, again, in defense of both music theory and academic music, it is changing quicker than I thought it would have, say, 5-6 years ago. Yeah. The paradigms are shifting, and we are getting a lot better at, I don't think it's shifting fast enough for me. And I think my students, undergrad and graduate, would certainly agree with that. But it is changing, and people are beginning to allow into their musical minds, musics that are not based in a quote unquote Western tradition. In chapter 2, I question that tradition greatly. And other musics, other genres, other peoples, other races of musical peoples, and other genders of musical peoples.
Which has got to make the field more interesting too, just intellectually, for people who study music to get to study, all of the different. I mean, it just massively opens the horizon of what the field can study and talk about and do. Surely,
here. I've heard from students. I remember one student at Oberlin interviewed me, and he was a white man, a pianist. We got to this point, and he said, I've made some of these changes in my own mind, and it's just been so liberating. He said. And it was liberating for me to hear somebody say that, because that's something I've said. This is rewarding work. I mean, it's hard, it's arduous, it's difficult. There'll be pushback, there are haters, but you do the work. It's rewarding for yourself, but it's also emancipating. It allows you to just open your mind like, oh, I don't have to sit there and think. It's not a matter of your taste or your opinions, but you no longer have to think that this music is the pinnacle of musical humanity on planet Earth. That is emancipating. Once you can let go of that nonsense, I mean, it's absolute nonsense to actually believe that Chopin, Schubert, Schumann, Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, did I get them all? Because they're only about 15 or 20, right? Actually are like this pinnacle of musical thought, and it was all leading to the greatness of Johannes Brahms, right? And when he died in 1897, well, then all hell broke loose and everything just went to shit. That's, okay. Seriously, there are people who are still clinging to that. And you know what, Nathan? I try to be a little empathetic to people who cling to that because it's their worlds are coming apart.
Sure.
And and I want to say to them, it doesn't have to be like that. You learned how to play the piano. Why don't you learn how to play the erhu or an oud or something else? You're a good musician. Do it. Just do something else.
There's a great YouTube video on this that quotes you a lot, and I can't remember the creator's name, but one of the things he does in this is, once he shows his viewers, the kind of buried assumptions about the superiority of a very narrow band of music, he's like, and now I am going to introduce you to someone who's going to talk about how music theory works in India with Indian music. And it's so totally fascinating. And you're watching this and you're going, oh, this just opens up whole new ways of listening and thinking.
Absolutely. That was Adam Neely. Yeah. And God bless Adam Neely for that. Really fine jazz bassist himself. And I think YouTube is where he actually makes his money, because he's got close to 2 million subscribers. And that's why people actually recognize me on the street every now and then, because that particular YouTube video has been seen over 2 million times. But yeah, it is exactly right. I mean, you can just bring in other cultures and their musics. And we, of course, have been obsessed with pitch and notes, C sharp and D natural in our system. And that is often presented as proof of the superiority of the system. Total hogwash. There's no truth to that whatsoever, right? People are like, oh, no, but there is, Phil. You have to just kind of, and I mean, the one thing I think that's also a little unnerving for folks is I have pretty good bona fides, right? I mean, I was a pretty damn good cello player back in the day, playing with a lot of great conductors and orchestras. I went through all the repertoire, all the cello stuff. And I have a PhD from Yale, which is a good school for music theory, right? One of the best programs in the country. And so to have these criticisms come from within is a little something that took music theory by surprise, I think. I don't think it should. I'm not actually a confrontational person. People might be surprised by that. but I can defend myself if I need to from a bunch of nonsense. And I can certainly block senders on my email account, which I do, every other day.
Well, that does get us to, your own disputes with others in the field, which are covered in this book, because, this even made the press, this whole dispute, because essentially you, as I understand it, have been, critiquing some of these foundational assumptions and saying that the assumptions, are clearly based on just racist ideology and aren't grounded in objective fact. And I think that there isn't really a good response to that. But you touched off a massive controversy through saying these things.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. A little tip from a race scholar. I advise people not to use the term racist. I say white supremacist ideology. And the word anti-Black, just for your listeners, is actually a very useful word, actually, because you can say anti-Blackness, and, you can often substitute racism or racist when you use that term, but it's a very specific type of racism. Of course, there are many types of racism. At any rate, when I hear people say racist, and then it's in a conversation with me, you won't hear me say racist ideology. You'll probably hear me say white supremacy. That's just kind of inside baseball for the race scholars listening. Of course, Black race scholars have known this. When a Black race scholar writes the word racialized, you can 9 times out of 10, you could substitute the word racist for that. It's just a euphemism for racist. At any rate, the controversy, that erupted in the summer of 2020 when this very bizarre journal issue of the journal Schenker Studies came out. I had no idea about it. They didn't invite me to do anything. It wasn't peer reviewed. And it kind of blew up because there was some very serious, aggressive anti-Blackness on the part of 10 authors. 5 authors, as I say in the book, were responding in good faith. But 10 authors were the core of the group. And apparently Timothy Jackson led the charge. That's what this panel found out. And I just kind of went through those 10 responses. I put that in air quotes for the listener. A response to a 9-minute spoken oral presentation and then written in a very aggressive anti-Black tone. I've said, I think on a podcast or two, that if I were a white person, it would have been an entirely different thing. And of course, people were like, no, they want to not talk about race. They want to say, that's not true. It would have been exactly the same. But I actually can prove it quite easily because no author could have written, Black people do this. Black people do that, kind of these crazy, insane responses where they're talking about Black people. Well, if it weren't a Black person who had criticized and, let's say, challenged, I like to use the word challenge. They like to say that I attacked. Fine, they can say that. I disagree. I challenged music theory. And this was the response to this perceived attack on music theory and one of their sacred figures, Heinrich Schenker. And so, it really ended up backfiring, I think, on them to a great extent. And more important, just like John McWhorter and his hit piece in the New York Times, they think they would get one response. They're like, oh, Phil Ewell, he's gonna read all of this stuff and he's gonna have to defend himself because we're calling him a Black anti-Semite and he's gonna go crazy. I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm not going to read it. Y'all are crazy. I'm not interested. I'm vacationing, man. Leave me alone. And I block and I block. And that really very much was consternating. And it's just caused them constant consternation ever since. I wish it didn't. They could just let go of all of it and stop. But they still keep their foot on the gas. So keep going.
Well, I have to ask you, because our listeners may not be familiar with this Heinrich Schenker guy who apparently, to those of us outside music theory, probably not heard of very much. Although, when a writer wrote about your controversy for Current Affairs, he said, he was in a PhD music theory program, and he said, I had to take 2 seminars solely on Schenker's theory. So this guy's been a big deal for a while.
Oh yeah. Well, as I mentioned, I think in the book, his is the only named music theory that's routinely required for graduate students. It is, in fact, the way that we have been taught to understand music theory, and which is, of course, in an American music theorist's mind, that's like all of music. We're gaslighted into thinking that it's more than it actually is. That's very much the way that we have learned to understand and interpret tonal music, and not just tonal music in a classical sense, but tonal music even all the way up until popular musics, which are quite tonal in with tertian harmonies, and you can still have pieces in D minor and C sharp minor and things like that, keys of tonalities, right? And absolutely, Heinrich Schenker, who died in 1935 in Vienna, was a huge figure, very influential, great pianist. He edited all 32 sonatas of Beethoven. He has it out there. I've heard that his fingerings are quite hierarchical, unsurprisingly. He was the real deal. He was a repugnant person, right? He praised Adolf Hitler, hated everybody. He was an anti-Semite, anti-Black, anti-woman, you name it. I explain it all in the book. But he rose to prominence in the 1930s here in the United States. He had disciples. And that's what took root. And to be honest, people think that, he had all the answers and that's the way we should understand tonal music. I lived for 7 years in Russia. I'm a fluent Russian speaker. They don't study Schenker at all. Never have. Schenker was an anti-Marxist, anti-communist. So it would have made no sense in the Soviet Union for him to be studied. The operable music theorist there, his name was Hugo Riemann for the initiated listener. So they don't study music, the tonal music in the same way, yet they in the Soviet Union, and frankly, in almost all of European countries where some of these traditions come from, they don't study Heinrich Schenker. They have, because of American influence, they know a little bit more about it. And you can probably take some classes. Certainly in England, you can take classes in Schenkerian analysis. But in fact, he's one of these saintly figures. And yes, absolutely, he was extremely racist and sexist. In fact, he's the only person I've ever called a racist in my very, very voluminous writings about all of this now. I actually did call him a racist. It's like, how dare you? And I'm like, did you see what he wrote? I mean, it was really awful. Yeah. Cannibal Africans, like you shouldn't intermarry, races, interbreeding races, murky, don't do it. I mean, the Jews are the greatest threat to Germany, and he himself was Jewish. So he was an anti-Semite Jew who died in 1935. It's just incredible how they reacted. I actually referred to this once as a stand your ground academic reaction. So stand your ground laws in the United States, as you know, and I presume the listeners know, were cooked up essentially to protect white people during an unhinged white reaction to a falsely perceived threat from blackness. I'll say that again. Stand your ground laws exist to protect unhinged reaction of whiteness to a falsely perceived threat from blackness. Now, that's stand your ground laws. When a white person shoots a black person dead, they're going to get off because they're going to say the black person was threatening me and it was a big black guy and he was very threatening. And then the jury's going to say, well, you're just protecting yourself, so stand your ground, you're free to go. But I say in response to the stand your ground academic response to my 9 minutes of speaking maybe 900 words about a really disgusting person, Heinrich Schenker, no guns were discharged. We're not litigating this in the state of Florida.
Yeah.
So they lost. One last time, I'll say what volume 12 of the Journal of Schenkerian Studies represented was an unhinged reaction of whiteness to a falsely perceived threat from blackness. That's exactly what happened. So I would like the listener to hear that. They can quote me. That is exactly what went on. And they lost in this sense. They lost. It absolutely redounded to my benefit. I didn't expect it. I didn't expect anything, actually. And it would have been much better for them to just be quiet and wait for some time to pass and then see what happened. But they didn't. They couldn't.
Conclude here by asking you are, a teacher as well as a theorist, so you must have thought a lot about how to teach music theory better, right? I mean, you are dealing with the set of textbooks that you've got. You have tried to figure out, what is a different, better approach that does make music welcoming for everyone. So I want to ask you a little bit about how you've managed to do that, or what you think a better teaching of music theory would look like. Because you make it clear in the book that it is not just those percentages of inclusion in the textbooks until they mirror the population.
Correct. Yeah, that's a good one. Well, I would open by saying that I'm co-authoring an undergraduate music theory textbook with two other authors, Cora Palfy and Rosa Abrahams. Hi, if you're listening. And we're contracted with Norton, and hopefully by a year from now, next fall, 2024, we'll have something out there. So this is something that I've thought about a lot with my co-authors. We are meeting weekly on Zoom, and we talk about all of these things. And it is hard. It's hard to kind of from the ground up build a new idea of what music theory is and then present it in a pedagogical fashion. But some of the highlights. We have an editorial board with people who are experts in other types of music. So someone with Indonesian gamelan, someone with Hindustani, North Indian ragas and rhythmic cycles. We have a jazz expert. We have an expert on timbre. We have a chapter in titled simply The Blues, because the blues is just so huge in the American musical lineage, right? Rock and roll is the blues and rhythm and blues, put together basically, right? We still have examples by a Bach, by a Beethoven, but, instead of having 50% of the book representing maybe 2 or 3 composers, that would be Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven probably, right? They're going to represent 2% of our book total, right? And that's like Chopin. In other words, we have a lot of different composers and genres, and there are some global traditions, as I've just mentioned, but that's actually very difficult because you can't, in 2 or 3 or 4 semesters of music theory, present all of the world's music. Obviously, that's just way too much. So you have to make choices. Well, before the choice was easy, actually, because we were taught that there were only about 15 great composers who ever lived ever. So you just have to choose what Chopin example you're going to use, which example by Schumann, Robert, not Clara, right? You had to have Robert because he was a man. Okay, let's leave Clara Schumann out of this because she couldn't be at the top of the hilltop. She was one rung below. Therefore, her music, which is absolutely gorgeous music, of course, couldn't exist because she was a woman. All of that nonsense is gone in our textbook. I mean, no disrespect to those who've written music theory textbooks before us. I think that even many of those authors, many of whom are still alive, would actually agree that the books were rooted in white supremacy and patriarchy, and that we need to do better for our students. It is a great disservice to our students if they are taught music in a late 20th century mindset in 2023. It shouldn't happen, and I hope to change that.
There's also a real strong element of this individualism and this idea of the genius composer who makes the good music. And it's, one person who sits down and makes music, not a culture.
The great man theory, exactly.
Yeah.
There is absolutely that element of individualism, the great man theory. But I have to say, and I'm sure you know this too, Nathan, that's kind of antiquated, right? People are now questioning objectivity, questioning certainly the great man theory. You can actually talk about the bad things about Thomas Jefferson in addition to the good things. Of course, there's a great backlash to that because there's tens of millions of Americans who are like, no, you can't talk about the bad things about Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
Like, okay, well, I can and I will and I do. Yeah. But we're having those debates now, whereas 20 years ago, there was no debate surrounding whether you could talk about how anti-Black and horrible Thomas Jefferson was on the one hand, along with his extremely influential documents that he wrote on the other, both of which happened, right? And we should present all of that to our students the same way we should present the horrors of Heinrich Schenker to our graduate students. It's the same thing.
Well, I hope that our listeners will pick up on music theory and making music more welcoming for everyone. And they can also look forward to your forthcoming introductory music theory textbook available upcoming from Norton. So, Philip, Ewell, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today to discuss this.
Nathan, thanks a lot. This has been a great conversation. Thanks for having me today.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.